talking to you and saying to you that a 10-pound POM, I didn't realise it, but it was actually the ability to travel from your home country to Australia for the princely sum of £10. And that's what you took up, wasn't it?
Yes, it was attractive to me because in many cases I wanted to have a look at other parts of the world, and I was in my early 20s, and it seemed a very cheap fare, considering that the Australian government were going to fly me out on a Boeing 707, which I was thrilled with, as I'd never been on a plane before, and this was a jet aircraft. And our first stop, the first stop of the tour was Rome. We weren't allowed out of the aircraft. We refueled and flew on to Karachi, I think, or Bangkok, I can't recall now, one of the two. And I really need to check out the schedule on that to find out where we did stop. But there was 4 or 5 stops before we arrived in Darwin, and that was very hot and humid. But the last voyage, or the last the length of the trip was from Darwin to Sydney, which is possibly 2,500 miles, which is a long way across Australia.
You didn't want to disembark in Darwin and look for any sort of work. The deal was you had to come to Sydney to start your journey. Is that right?
Yes, that was correct. The immigration officials were waiting for us, and I was possibly with some of the people. I didn't know anybody that was a 10-pound POM on the flight, so I wasn't familiar with who was arriving at Sydney with me. But when I did arrive, I was escorted to a compartment in the airport complex and given a pass, which gave me a taxi ride to my accommodation.
Yeah.
Also given the accommodation. And the accommodation was very fresh, and it was nice, and I stayed there a few nights before moving on to better things. But my first day in Australia was walking around, getting familiarised with the surroundings, which was completely different.
That's the lay of the land in Sydney.
Yeah, completely different to what I grew up with in the industrial Midlands of England, which fascinated me. I've always been a walker, so walking through the suburbs of Sydney were quite a joy and a great experience.
And when you went to Sydney, that's where you got your first position. You found a job there.
Yeah. I moved out to Ashfield, where there was other migrants from England, migrants of the same as myself. Made friends with them easily, and I got a job. My first job was at the local council, Drummoyne Council, which is a suburb just out of Ashfield, and I was putting with a gang there, building footpaths, which was interesting work.
And how long did you remain in Sydney for?
I remained in Sydney for 6 months,
yep,
from July till February the next year, 1966. And in that time in Sydney, I got friendly with a lot of guys, and we decided in February of 1966 to move forward to Brisbane, have a look at Queensland. And I met I was friendly with a guy there that had a Zephyr 6, which is quite a big car. So the 4 of us jumped into that in February and just motored on to Brisbane. There wasn't a great deal of work in Brisbane when we arrived, so we slept at Surfers Paradise for a few nights on the beach, which was quite an interesting experience.
In a sleeping bag?
Yeah, and some of us didn't have sleeping bags. We just slept there with a blanket or an overcoat or something.
Okay.
And then we got accommodation in a local hostel there, which was accommodation for particular migrants from Britain. There I stayed for 4 months, and then headed up to Townsville on the train.
Did you get any work in Brisbane?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think what I did in Brisbane. It's been so long.
Was it local work, physical work?
Physical work, yeah, I like physical work. It's good for the physique, good for your health. I was very fit, still am.
Yeah.
And I'm blessed with that.
Well, you can tell that by your chiseled physique.
Oh my God. What is this? Okay, I'm just trying to think what I did in Brisbane.
Well, you can come back to that, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
So if you go back, when you left Brisbane, where did you go from there?
Brisbane, I travelled up the coast on the train to Townsville, which was a very slow process. It was a very comfortable train, very modern, diesel, but it was very, very slow, and there was only one track up there, and it was very slow, and it's quite a distance from Brisbane to Townsville. If you're going through Rockhampton, Mackay is on the coast, but there is one regret on travelling up to Townsville. I really should have taken a good look at the Great Barrier Reef, which is one of the wonders of the world. The Australian Barrier Reef. I never did see that.
Okay.
I arrived in Brisbane and found a job on in a signal and telegraph department, checking out all the telephone wires from Townsville through to Cloncurry and onto Mount Isa, which is about 700 or 800 miles. On arriving in Mount Isa, I quit that job with the telegraph and found myself with as a surveyor's assistant.
Right. And which area was that?
That was in Mount Isa.
Yep.
And that time was mid-1966. I did a few months out in the outback. And you know, it was a funny thing, I never wore hats, and I still don't to this day.
No.
But I was informed through the harsh Australian outback heat and sun that I did need to wear a hat, and eventually I didn't wear one, which is probably a good thing.
Very good thing, actually, because you could have ended up with skin cancer.
Yeah.
And
in March of 1967, I travelled to Darwin.
Yep.
By bus, didn't have a car. I didn't spend too much time in Darwin, a couple of months, not even that, probably 6 weeks. And then I caught a bus down to Alice Springs, and arriving in Alice Springs in 1967, mid-1967, July 1967, I'd covered almost 2 years of my stay in Australia. So from Sydney to Alice Springs, 2 years had just flown by. So I was exempt from the £10. I was exempt for paying the Australian government back. What I mean by that is that I needed to stay in Australia for 2 years. If I had departed back to England or left within the 2 years, I was compelled by law to pay the Australian government back for the fee that they charged me for flying out to Australia.
The £10?
Yes.
Well, it wouldn't have broken the bank because you would have saved a bit of money, surely.
Yes, I did. From Darwin, I travelled by bus to Alice Springs. Arriving there in mid-1967, I checked into the local Labour department and found myself a job, which was really lucky because there was work in Australia, plenty of it. But they were building the US. There was a US company involved in Pine Gap, building a tracking station for the rockets that were sent in outer space for the US government out at Pine Gap, which is about 300 miles southeast of Alice Springs. I happened to be lucky with a position out there, which I took as a labourer, clearing the bush, the spinifex, the bull dust, before the machinery came in, which was a few weeks after. And that was an interesting saga out there because knowing what the Americans are, they do things right. We lived in very, not luxurious billets, but they were quite comfortable and clean and tidy. Food was good, and the money was good.
And did you build a soccer field?
Yeah, there was a lot of Irish and Scottish people out there, and they're familiar with soccer. And I built, with the aid of a lot of the guys, a soccer field out there. Got the carpenters to rustle up a couple of goal posts. We marked the ground out with chalk or whatever we could get our hands on. And on the weekends we played soccer. The Americans weren't familiar with soccer, so we stuck those in goal and told them their prime objective was to keep the ball out from the back of the net.
Well, I'm sure they grasped that.
Yeah, they did. And it was great. It was great, and I enjoyed my stay out there. And from there on, I did 9 months out there and saved a couple of $1,000 or more. And from there, I caught a train down from Alice Springs to Port Augusta in South Australia, and then I caught a luxury train from there.
But you never went through Adelaide?
Never. I did not spend any time in Adelaide, no.
And the reason for that was because there wasn't a heck of a lot of work there?
There wasn't a lot of work, so I stayed clear of that. And from there I went across the Nullarbor Plain, which incidentally is 400 miles of the longest rail track in the world.
Yep.
Is the Nullarbor Plain, onto Perth. Onto Kalgoorlie, which is a stop before Perth.
Yep.
Inside West Australia. Now at that particular time, the rail gauges in Australia were quite strange. They were all different gauges in each state. So I should imagine if Japan had invaded Australia, they'd have been in the right pickle, because they'd have been in panic stations, because the rail gauges in each state were different. There, I caught a train from Kalgoorlie, because it was a different gauge, to Perth, and the train reminded me of the old Wild Wild West trains.
Like the Iron Horse?
Yeah, you see in the movies.
Yep.
The carriages were so old compared with the luxury train from Port Augusta to Kalgoorlie.
Yep. So you started looking for work in Perth?
Yes. And let me think. I like Perth. I got a job on a construction site building a motorway.
Yep.
That's a steel fixer. That means the steel goes into the concrete before they pour concrete.
Yep.
And I enjoyed that. As I say, manual work was my preference, and I was fit.
Yep. It's like your gardening work. When you're in the garden, you feel closer to God.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I like the contact with the earth.
Sure.
It's wonderful.
You're a man of the earth, a man of the soil.
Yeah, I'm not an office person.
No, you're not. No.
I'm an outdoor person.
Yeah. And how long did you remain in Perth?
Believe it or not, I was in Perth for 8 months.
That's
I
pretty
liked
good.
Perth.
Yeah.
Yep, I did.
Yep.
And
from there?
I worked from Perth. I decided that I needed to travel up north to Carnarvon, which is on the coast, Port Hedland, which was a mining town. No, I'm going to backtrack here. I did not. From Perth I went to Kalgoorlie, and the reason I went to Kalgoorlie is that I applied for a position with a company called Steel Construction Company, and they in turn wanted me to take a truck up, a international truck.
Yep. With
a tray on the back, and they wanted me to take some stuff up there to Cambolda.
Yep.
And I picked this truck up from Steel Construction Company in Perth, and I drove 300 miles to Kalgoorlie.
Yep.
By the time I got to Kalgoorlie, I was out of fuel.
But you'd never driven a truck like that before and had a crash box?
No, I did not. And that was quite an experience. And in Kalgoorlie, I'd run out of fuel. But on the back of the tray, I had a 44-gallon drum of fuel, so that was no trouble. I siphoned that out from the drum to the fuel tank.
Good.
And drove out to Camboldia, where I delivered the truck. But I happened to get a job out there. Now I'll backtrack a little bit here. The reason I went to Kalgoorlie, to Kambolda, was they were building a township in Kambolda out of Kalgoorlie.
Yep.
And I remained there for many, many months.
Yep.
With this construction company building the town up. And I drove a concrete mixer, so that was interesting.
Yep.
And we were billeted in like trailer-like things with different compartments.
Yep.
And it was very comfortable. We showered there. We had meals there. We were really well looked after.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Yep. And after that, when you finished your work there, when did you return back to Sydney?
At that stage, I hadn't been north
Yep.
I hadn't seen the great northwest of West Australia, like places
Okay.
like Kambolda, Dampier, and Port Hedland.
Yep.
So I left Kalgoorlie, and at that stage I got a Volkswagen Beetle. Yeah. And I travelled on to Meekatharra, which is the next town out of Kalgoorlie, which is about a couple of 100 miles.
Yep.
But the roads out there in the late 60s were not sealed. They were full of bloody bull dust.
Yep.
And it wasn't very advisable to travel during the at night, because you didn't know what pothole was waiting to invite you in. So I would notify the police department in Kalgoorlie that I was travelling to Meekatharra. And when I arrived in Meekatharra, I went straight to the local police station there and told them that I just arrived safely.
Okay.
I spent a week there and in a hotel, in a pub hotel. And I went out, in that week, I went out with some roo shooters shooting kangaroos at night.
Oh.
And I'd never tasted roo meat cooked over the barbecue, which we experienced.
Was it lean?
It was different tasting, and I quite liked it. But to this day, I've never ever tasted it again. That was interesting. But what was the most interesting part of Meekatharra was I did a silly thing. After 3 or 4 days there, I decided my next stop was Marble Bar, which is 300 miles from Meekatharra. And silly old me decided to hit the road at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Can you imagine this? Now, as I said, there's no seal on these roads in the outback, and I travelled along this road at night. And I had reservations about ever arriving anywhere, because all I could see at night was complete pitch black, apart from the headlights of my car. And bearing in mind this was a Volkswagen Beetle, and I carried on the front bags and bags of water just in case I ran out.
Yep.
And I did arrive in Marble Bar, and I was very, very pleased to have got there in one piece. I was very thirsty. It was 11 o'clock at night, and I pulled the car alongside, which I thought was an old west town, where there were old horse hitch rails.
Yep.
It was like you could tie your horse up. So I pulled the Volkswagen in front of one of those, got out, all enthusiastic, walked into this pub, and I was so pleased to get there. I don't know what the hell I said to the locals. They thought I must have been nuts. And I drank a big bottle of beer very fast.
Oh.
It was after 11 o'clock at night, and I found some accommodation just along the street and went to sleep.
Yep. Okay. And after that, when you woke up the next day, did you work in that area, or did you keep moving on?
I left the next day to head for from Marble Bar to Port Hedland, which is about another 50 miles, still on dirt track. Plenty of signs along the street telling you to take plenty of water, and stay clear of kangaroos which run across the road periodically. I arrived in Port Hedland, didn't work there, slept on the beach a couple of nights, found that I wasn't going to stay there at all, so after a couple of nights on the beach I headed back down on the coast road to Carnarvon.
Okay.
Carnarvon is a Scottish town name, which is a big town there, and that was the first time I'd ever struck bitumen. Now the Australians call a tar seal road bitumen.
Yep.
And from Carnarvon all the way down to Perth, which is another 600 miles, was complete and utter bliss. It was tar seal all the way.
Yep.
No bull dust, no rubbish. And that's where I struck a huge kangaroo, which they call bull roos, on the front of my Volkswagen, small Volkswagen car, and demolished one side of the headlight.
And demolish the kangaroo.
And demolished the kangaroo, but I never did see the kangaroo.
No.
The kangaroo disappeared in the bush, which they normally do. This guy was a big fella.
Yep.
But I should have never done that during the... I think I set off at night, another night job. I should have never set off during the night. I should have waited till the morning. It was there when I arrived in Perth that the insurance company wouldn't insure me again.
Oh.
Because I'd made too many claims with kangaroo hits on the side of the car. I arrived in Perth, because Perth. I remember Perth very well. It was only a stopping off place because my next move from Perth was to cross the Nullarbor Plain by road. I'd already done it by train, and I did cross it by road. And from the West Australia side, the West Australia side to the South Australian side, West Australia had sealed their main highway to the South Australian border, but it's not very wide.
Yep.
So every time a car came along to you the other way, you really had to pull off onto the dirt. Hence, all your left side tyres wore out faster than your right, because you were in the bull dust all the time. When I arrived at the Ceduna border, I stayed there the night with a lot of other people, because from Ceduna to Eucla on the South Australian side, there was 200 miles of the worst bull dust and holes in the road you've ever seen in your life. That night I slept on the back of a truck, and the next morning I set off. Arrived in Port Augusta, and I needed a reconditioned engine.
That's right, and it cost you £250.
$250.
That's right.
So I waited overnight to get that fixed, and then the next day, which was New Year's Day,
Yeah.
I set off for Melbourne.
Yep.
And I followed the coast road round to Melbourne. I had reservations about going to South Australia because I'd circumnavigated Australia, and I thought, well, by missing Adelaide, I'd probably miss the most important part, the Barossa Valley, where they make all the wine and they grow the wine. But I decided I'd go on to Melbourne, which I did.
Well, you weren't a winemaker, were you?
No.
So in Melbourne, what did you do?
I worked in Melbourne for a company that catered for the Carlton United Brewery in Melbourne.
Delivering
beer to pubs on the back of these Bedford trucks.
Yep. So it was thirsty work.
Yeah, at every place I went to, everybody was so grateful I'd arrived with a new supply of beer. They would always ask me, after I'd unloaded all the beer from the truck, whether I'd like some refreshments, and I was tempted to stay there most of the time, but no, I resisted the alcohol content of the drink. I decided that an orange squash or something would do because I was working.
Yep.
And I stuck to that.
Well, that was very responsible.
Yeah.
But drunken driving in those days isn't a big thing like it is today.
And but I did acquire a few trays of beer working for the brewery, and so when I did leave Melbourne eventually,
Yep. Melbourne, where did you go to?
I went back to Sydney.
Back to Sydney.
And by the time I arrived in Sydney, which was July of 1969,
Yep.
I had completed 4 years.
4 years in Australia. You'd been
So,
right round it.
Yeah.
And you'd enjoyed every minute of it.
I did, and it was quite a venture. But as a lot of people have said, that I perhaps should have written my memoirs.
Yes.
I didn't think at the time it was
A big deal.
a big deal until leaving Australia on the 20th of September 1969
For New Zealand.
for New Zealand. I was accompanied to the dockside by a lass, a young lady, who suggested I put this down.
Well, this is your
In
opportunity
writing.
now. We've got a videotape of it, which will be up on YouTube, and it will stay there for eternity. So there you go.
Oh, Ainsley, you're too good.
No, not
No.
really. No, I've got it there forever. Is there any other thing you'd like to add about your trip to Australia?
Yes.
What is it?
I perhaps should have written this down as this great trip happened.
Yeah, but you kept a whole lot of postcards from each area
Yes,
that
I
you
did.
visited,
Yes, I put them in an
and that's like a diary anyway.
Yes, and the time I arrived, the time I left.
Exactly.
It was a great trip, and I'm very confident in, even suggesting to people that they do something like that.
Exactly.
It's a part of your life. In your 20s, you're free and easy. There's no commitment.
No. You can see why it's called the big country.
It's huge. It's just an incredible place. It's so dry and so barren and so much of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Rushton.
Actually, absolute pleasure. I hope everything is okay on the story.